Thank you for tuning into another Blender tutorial. Today I'm going to be teaching you the methods of UV unwrapping. Let's start by adding a monkey, and we'll tab into edit mode. We'll grab this over here so that we can work with a little bit more stuff, and we'll change this to a UV image editor. When you unwrap an object, you flatten it and so that you can apply textures. You can click unwrap, and you see here that it creates a flattened image of whatever we have here. It does a terrible job at it, however, because we don't have any seams marked on it. There are different ways of doing things. If you don't want to go through the tedious aspect of adding custom seams, you can use a Smart UV project, which takes an angle threshold and creates islands for you. The more islands you have, the less distortion there will be on your texture, but the more texture seams you will see. The higher this angle limit is, the fewer islands you have, and the lower it is, the more islands you have. You can do a cube projection, which takes the object and basically takes a snapshot of it, front, back, top, side, bottom, and flattens it out that way. Cylinder projection does much of the same, but it unwraps it as a cylinder. And it's also important to know that your viewport is what determines how this looks. And so if we were to unwrap this again as a cylinder projection, it would be different because it's different on the screen. If we look at the back, If we look at the back and we do a cylinder projection, it's going to be different again. Sphere projection is another way to do things. We can also project from view, which creates just a perfect image. Like if we were to take a picture and do one-for-one copy, and project from view bounds, which expands it to fill the screen there. The one that gives you the most customization, though, however, is marking the seams and then unwrapping it. So we're going to mark some seams on here. Ideally, you would want to mark seams where you had where the texture didn't matter if it was, you could see the crease, because wherever you're going to put a seam, there will be a crease in the texture. So this is actually a terrible place to apply a seam because it's going right down the middle of the face, where arguably is where you're going to be looking the most. And so don't do what I do if you're going to be doing this for to render anything or for a game asset. But for the purposes of tutorial, this will work just fine. So we're going to mark these seams by clicking here. Once you mark a seam, they turn red. If you need to clear a seam for whatever reason, you can do so, and then it just turns back to black. Mark that seam, select everything, and now when we unwrap it, it creates it as you see here, which is perfect for what we're trying to do. Now, when you want to use as much space on this as you can. The more space you use here, right now we've got an empty space here, empty space here. The more space you use on the screen, the more detail you'll have on this. And you also want to maintain the area of the polygons. So for example, if this polygon right here has a certain area, let's say it has an area of 5 units squared, then you want to make sure that the polygon over here has an area of 5 units squared. This smaller polygon might have an area of 1 unit squared, and we want to make sure it has an area of 1 unit squared here. In order to test that, you can add a UV image, which you can do by clicking down here, and you have different options that you can have. You can name it, you can change the size and the X and Y axes. When you're working with UV coordinates, it's U and V stand in for the X and Y. You can change the color, and then you can determine what kind of image you want it to be. We want it to be a UV grid for what we're doing. Hit OK, and it creates an image of a grid that we can start to play with. In order to see what this image looks like over here, while you're in Blender Render, you can click on the viewport shading method and click texture, and you see what's going on. Smaller squares are better. That's how you're going to get more detail. And you'll notice that in the ears, where our squares are really small, where the detail is all kind of stacked on top of each other, the squares are really big. The areas that are really big, comparatively, like the top of the head, the squares are rather small. Ideally, you'd want all the squares to be the same size, or at least the squares in the areas that you're going to be looking at more to be smaller. And you do that by sculpting, moving the vertices around in the UV, or you can even grab individual vertices and move them around. And as you can see, as I add a lot more area to those polygons, we get a lot more detail in them, but we also see that they parallelogram, which isn't necessarily the best because it's going to skew our image. You can stack UVs on top of each other. So we have two eyes that are basically the same. They're just flipped images of each other. I'm going to grab this, and you can see as I grab it, the eyeball moves, the texture on the eyeball moves here. And I'm going to scale this -1 so that it rotates. And I think by doing so, we make it so that these will overlap. Not quite, but close enough. And then since these are going to be symmetrical, it's okay that these overlap, because let's say we were to draw an eyeball right here where this was going to be, then we'd see an eyeball on both sides, which is just fine. We want to add more detail to it, so we'll select all the vertices, scale it up so that we can have as little squares as possible in there. And now we have a lot more detail in our eyes. We can do the same thing with our face. Faces are symmetrical, and so we can scale this -1 to flip it. Nope, scale -1, scale X -1. There we go. Then we'll just rotate it until it lines up with this. And it doesn't have to be perfect for purposes of the tutorial, but because you'll get what I'm trying to do anyway. But if you line these up, now you can use the same texture for both sides. Select everything. Control plus selects the adjacent vertices, so we'll just make sure we've got all of them selected. Grab this. We left some behind, so we'll hit Control plus again, get some more. Grab it. We haven't left any behind now. We'll scale this up so that our polygons get smaller. You'll notice we can escape the bounds of the image here. And it looks like that's just fine and dandy. When you're doing UV with the UV texture grid applied, it is fine. But when you have an image here that you want to apply the texture to the surface of this object, it's not going to work. Anything that goes over the limits is not going to have any texture applied to it. So just make sure that everything is within the bounds of your object here, and just play with everything so that you fill in all these empty spaces and so that all the squares are the same size. It's a tedious project, but it's worth it to make your objects look good when you render them. Anyway, if you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment below. I do read all my comments, and I'm happy to ask any questions you might have. Thanks for watching.